Good afternoon, Oliver. It is good connecting with you again.
Good afternoon. Happy spring.
Happy spring. And yeah, we have a wonderful weather outside today, a little bit chilly, but it's great. And something we've mentioned many times before, but certainly something we're looking forward here in Michigan. And we're recording this a couple of days after Easter, actually 2 days after Easter. And this is going to be a little bit late by the time it comes out, but we thought it would be a good opportunity to reflect a little bit on the meaning of Easter, what it means for us, what it means to celebrate Easter specifically in this world. I'm thinking of some of the news items that are coming to us in terms of settler violence in Palestine, people not being able to celebrate Easter properly, as well as people, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. There were some issues there. There was no audience. And I think people have noted, and I don't know if that's true, but that is the first time in a very long time that has been prohibited in a way. And even during World War II, we had services. And so there's a lot of issues, a lot of turmoil going on in the world. But we don't have a political show. We don't want to talk about so much about these issues, but more about the challenges of Easter generally in a broken world. But before we go into that, anything interesting that happened to you in the last week that you wanted to share, and any updates on your training when it comes to your huge adventure this summer, actually in Maine, in a month or so, I believe, your climbing
That's
expeditions. Right. Yeah, so what's going on with you? What happened with you?
Yeah, so two major updates probably. First, I'm very grateful for the work here of our student worker, Danielle Paul Ray. He's a master's student here at the seminary and has worked for probably now half a year here on a research project that is faculty research grant supported to align the Greek words of the Septuagint, the translation of one of the first translations of the Old Testament, and align them with the Hebrew words, the source text of which we assume the Septuagint was translated of. So he finished it after a gruesome 6 months of computing and programming and a lot of linguistic investigations. And last Friday he finished his work, and I've been able to experiment with the data a little bit. And this is exciting. This is exciting both for research in general on a more public level, because we are posting everything on GitHub, so it's freely available. And then for me personally, because it allows to trace kind of developments of theological thought as you find them in the Hebrew text, in later receptions of that Hebrew text, in that case the Septuagint. And I'm presently experimenting with the words of fear, the verb to fear God. How is the conceptual linguistic utterance that we find in the Masoretic text and the Hebrew text, how is that being potentially changed or transformed or further developed in the Septuagint text, in the Greek text? So this is always fun to work with data and trace how humans have received holy scripts and have sometimes altered them slightly in order to make them meaningful to their context and to their life setting. So I'm really happy and glad and proud of Danielle Paul Ray, who has pulled this off now.
Oh, great. Thanks for the update. Sounds very, very exciting. This is really in your field. I know you mentioned some time ago how this word fear, the valence it has, depending right on the context, how it's being used in the Old Testament. And what did you say last time? It never appears. What did you say? The fear.
Yeah, exactly. What happens, at least in the Hebrew manuscripts, that basically the valence that would trigger fear in the sense of to be afraid of is not connected with the divine name or with Yahweh or Elohim, the Hebrew God, but only related to objects of fear, the enemy, soldiers, wars, famines, and so on. But there's an exception of 5 cases in the Holiness Code in Leviticus where the legal text says if you touch one of the vulnerables of society, we're speaking about the orphan or the widow or the elderly person, or the foreigner, the immigrant, so to say, if you touch them and disadvantage them, then you rather have to be afraid of me. So these are the 5 exceptions, very interesting exceptions, as they highlight the importance of social justice also in the Old Testament. So you can kind of make an argument based on linguistic data and not just on theological concepts that you cheer.
Beautiful. Yeah, this is something, I know we talked about it before during one of our episodes, and it's nice to be reminded of that. Well, on my end, before we go into discussing Easter and resurrection connected with the message of Easter, just had a wonderful meeting this morning. I was invited by one of our colleagues, Tihomir Lazic, who is teaching at Newbold College. He is a professor of systematic theology, does some wonderful work on the church, ecclesiology. Currently, I believe, is he the president or the vice president? I believe the president of ASRS. So he is just a great guy, talented in so many different ways. And what they have these seminars, and they are inviting faculty and mostly graduate students, or what they call postgraduate students, and then invite different scholars throughout the world who are sharing on their research. And so for me, that was a wonderful time to be with them and use this opportunity kind of to consolidate a little bit where I stand, what my research interests are. And that has been incredibly helpful. I've been very grateful to the Society of Adventist Philosophers, who has enabled me in the last couple of years to present papers that are basically always on the same theme from a different perspective, all of them dealing with what I could be variously called the ethics of knowing from different perspectives. So for me to be able to have that and for them, but also for myself to consolidate a little bit articulate my research agenda and my interests in concise language, and then connect it with how that actually applies to discipleship, how it applies to ministry, how it applies to leadership, just showing the relevance of these issues. That was very meaningful to me. I'm very grateful. They were very gracious, had some good questions. For instance, one question was, and that's what he asked me, because I think there's a topic for this year's ASRS meetings, which are going to take place in Denver in November. And this is this large Adventist society of scholars, religion or religious scholars, who are meeting adjacent to the American Academy of Religion every year. And they've picked a topic very much about the church in present times and present truth. And then he asked me, well, what do you think about, since you're interested in truth and truthfulness, what do you think about present truth? And it was quite interesting to me at this moment, kind of a clarity in my mind at least emerged, is that is a deeply problematic concept, not because the concept is problematic, but how we arrive at it is problematic. In other words, it is not forgiven. It is not a given. That's what I wanted to say. It's not a given that we have a pristine access to what present truth should amount to. Like all of us, for instance, we have, because of and this comes now, my research is kind of embodied knowing, how our experiences, ethnicity, character, commitments, trauma, life stories position us in the world and lead us to have different threat perceptions and different perceptions of possibilities. Now, all of that, this kind of identity, what I call identity gestalt, the shaping of my identity in the combination of all of these factors, will certainly lead me to perceive the world in a certain way and will lead me to articulate what I think should be present truth and what we should be about. It's not as if that is quite obvious what that should be. And then the second problem is, and I don't know what your experience is, that once we then, from our own ideological perspective or our worldview perspective, or however you want to call that perspective, once we have these threat perceptions and possibility perceptions, what we then tend to do is to read that into the tradition and somehow try to make the tradition as if the tradition was always about that. And now we are actually uncovering a hidden kernel of, let's say, what pioneers always believed. Unbeknownst to us, actually reading into it something that is completely a result of our leanings. So that is what we had a good conversation on that. And I find this to be an important issue that requires a lot of sort of clarity and thinking about.
Yeah, beautiful. I mean, present truth, particularly for an Adventist audience or for the Adventist community, is such a hot topic, right? And it seems to me that the discussion then was quite a bit about the mechanisms that create this import of meaning or this projection of meaning onto the term present truth. And there seem to be, I'm not really in the discussion, but I just saw that I think Rainer Bruinsma published an article or a book on the topic recently, that there are also, let's say, a shift towards more, and this is not a critique, but just an observation, that there is a shift towards the community of believers creating, or individuals of the community of believers creating a certain definition of present truth that might have been quite different to, let's say, the apocalyptic version of present truth that pioneers had handled much more from, let's say, objective perspective, not in the sense of truth, but in the sense of the apocalyptic happenings, right, in the so-called heavenly sanctuary, and the present truth that is perceived, let's say, from a divine perspective rather from a human perspective. So there might be several concepts of present truth that need to be discussed on the level of the community of faith, and how they produce ideas of present truth, the constant updating of a community that is required and necessary in order to keep faith alive. And on the other side, the covenantal part, so to say, the divine part of present truth, and the updating on that front, which, as a high view of Scripture person, would need to be revealed and shown to us. So that's a very interesting discussion. I wish I could have been there, because I enjoyed, your presentation the last 2 years on truth and ethics. I still remember, your excellent presentation on Thomas Nagel's work, and how truth, or the objectivity, I think that was the topic really, right? So the claim or the search for objectivity is not search that is, a search that is unaware of the complexities of the matters of objectivity, but a search that is really driven by the heart for community, for finding common grounds, for striving for something that could make us all agree on a reality that is more than us, right? So I really loved that. I'm not sure whether I summarized it, well,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
And it was this year what you did was, it's now last year, November. It was a beautiful continuation of that line of thought. So yeah, thank you for the research that you're doing, and for the inspiration that you give us to rethink.
You're very kind, very kind. Thank you so very much. But let's now turn to the topic for today. I remember Oliver, some years ago, when I was still an associate pastor, my senior pastor, who was just at that time, he was really a good guy. I was doing my PhD. He always supported me in working on my dissertation. So I won't go into that. But I still distinctly remember how he had an Easter sermon. Now, I don't quite remember if it was specifically for Easter or it was for some other occasion, or whether he just preached on the Gospels. I don't recall that. But he preached on the words that we find in the Gospels, when the women who are appearing there, I should have looked it up exactly in the Gospels. This isn't to my detriment. But basically the words of the angel when he says, "He's not here. He's not here." And that being the most important utterance ever stated in the history of humanity. He is not here. And I remember that moment. And then on the other hand, I've read some thinkers. I'm thinking of Bishop Spong. He once stated this, what I will say right now, but I know there are other theologians who say similar things. And what do I have in mind? Spong once said that we should not burden ourselves, or we should not be obsessed, or we should not focus on such trivialities, on whether Jesus is resurrected or not. And when I read this, it absolutely struck me that one could see himself or herself and announce himself or herself as a Christian and not believe in the resurrection. How is it even possible? How is it supposed to work? Now, I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts? How did the Easter message impact you as an individual? And what are some of the challenges, perhaps, that you have? And perhaps to lead into some of the challenges, I think it is very interesting, for me at least, when we look at the Gospel of Mark and when we read it without the later addition that was then added at the end of the Gospel. And everyone who has a Bible, you can open it up and read chapter 16. You will see that it stops. And there's a note that the last part of that chapter comes from way later sort of manuscripts. It's not present in the earliest manuscripts. And if you read it that way, then the last, at least in many translations, the last word is, and they were afraid. And that's how the gospel ends. So I wonder if there is a way of reading the Easter message that is obviously a tremendous source of consolation for me and for all of us. We think of 1 Corinthians 15, and if there's no resurrection, we are the most miserable of all people. And yet recognize some element of kind of the unsettling aspect of it. So I wonder, how do you think about it, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm really interested in how this conversation develops, because you have on the one side you have these both traditions that are woven into those New Testament texts, namely clear statements about doubt, that people were not, even the disciples were not convinced that actually Jesus resurrected. And then you have parallel to them these other threads that are woven into the fabric of the text, where we are called to have faith, and where to a certain amount Jesus even tries to argue, to defend, to prove his resurrected existence, if we think about the Gospel of John and the encounter with Thomas. So that's on the one side, these two deposits, so to say, of post-resurrection experiences, doubt and faith, and they come together and they are not easily separated in these texts. So almost as if this historical deposit is kept or remembered as an input for the Christian communities that develop after these events, to take both of these traditions serious and to replicate perhaps in a certain way the experience of these disciples after resurrection. And every time when Easter comes in different gradations over the different years, I have found myself going back to these texts and working with these texts and reading these texts always slightly different. Definitely this year this has happened too with, as you know, I've studied the Gospel of Mark for now quite a significant amount of time, and coming back to now these doubt and faith traditions, they created a new perspective for me on reading them. We might be able to get to that topic here in a bit, but I want to confirm that these, let's say, agnostic versions of Christianity that you're referring to, really particularly in perhaps Northern Europe, a development is traceable, that these are not outliers anymore. They are actually a significant part of particularly the Protestant community, of academics or pastors that are developing forms of Christianity that don't rely anymore, don't need anymore the historical versions of it, namely the physical resurrection, let's say, of Christ, and the real ascension and the return of Christ as a historical act. But they have kind of metaphysized these stories. To give you an example, actually, from my own experience in the Netherlands, when I lived there and I worked as a professor for the Protestant University of the Netherlands, where Reformed pastors and Lutheran pastors are being trained. I found myself sometimes in these pastoral training weekends with excellent pastors. I mean, they put a lot of shame on my own experience sometimes of my own community when it comes to taking, the ancient script series, reading the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia and the Nestle Alland as integral parts of devotional exercises that these pastors do. But anyway, so I was confronted with the fact of, for example, Klaas Hendrikse, a Reformed pastor, well-known Reformed pastor in the Netherlands, who confessed that he is an atheist. So one of his books that he published in the early 2000s was Geloven in een God die niet bestaat. So faith in a God who does not exist, and the subtitle is The Manifest of an Atheist Pastor. And a little later he published the word God exists, God does not exist, and Jesus is his son. Kind of describing that in a post-Christian era, there's still room for Christian faith, so to say. And he's an excellent pastor when it comes to sermons. I mean, they are super inspiring. He really works closely with these texts and exegetical attitude towards text. You have this also, I think, in scholarship here in the US, like Bart Ehrman, who's a well-known, New Testament scholar, excellent
recently,
research.
By the way, recently debated with Russ Doubthead at New York Times. They had a debate and conversation on resurrection. If anyone wants to look up that podcast, you can actually see they had this conversation on the resurrection precisely with him. Yes.
Yeah, excellent. So, it's a nice display of, if you listen to him or you read his books, how this kind of disconnect from historical Christianity is happening, and an ethical reading of these doubt texts and faith texts is happening. Or, I mean, even Walter Brüggemann could be taken as an example on the Old Testament front. So I've just here a little quote that I would like to share with you, because for me it's a quote that belongs to Easter, or to the Easter discussion in his theology of the Old Testament. I mean, Walter Brüggemann, probably the leading Old Testament scholar here in the US, and an amazing author. I mean, he has, I'm not sure how he did that, every year a couple of books that he's writing and publishing. I'm happy if I publish a book, once in 10 years or so. Here I'm reading from his theology of the Old Testament, where he says, "Therefore, in doing Old Testament theology, we must be careful to not import essentialist claims that are not authorized by this particular and peculiar rhetoric." And he refers to the rhetoric of the Old Testament. And then it comes, "I shall insist, as consistently as I can, that the God of the Old Testament theology, as such, lives in, with, and under the rhetorical enterprise of this text, and nowhere else, and in no other way." So the rhetorical enterprise operates with ontological assumptions, but those assumptions obviously are rhetorical. They're not real. I could give a couple of more quotations, and with that I'm not downplaying the work of Walter Brüggemann. I think every serious reader of the Old Testament will benefit from the excellent work of Walter Brüggemann, but you have kind of this ontological disconnect when it comes to these texts.
Okay, let me just intervene, if I can just ask just for clarification. So because there's sometimes a lot of these thinkers, it's kind of a play on words. So when they say they're atheists, what they mean, they're atheists, right? They refuse the belief in certain metaphysical deity, but not really in the existence of some sort of spiritual entity. What
That's
you're
right.
telling me, that this is not this. This is not simply a deconstruction of ontotheology, so those people who know the post-Heideggerian tradition, of the kind of a certain conception, philosophical conception of God, certain conception of being, and then they say, well, I'm an atheist, insofar as atheism entails the rejection of certain philosophical God. What you're saying is this is not that. They actually do not believe, as in the case of this pastor in the Netherlands, he doesn't actually believe in any supernatural entity. Is that the claim?
I would say Klaus Hendrik is an agnostic. So he's not belonging to the group of new atheists or so. So he's not trying to make an argument for atheism, but he runs on this doubt tradition, so to say. We cannot make any claims about this, and that's fine. So that would be his position. Therefore, let's be inspired by those holy texts without having to believe in,
So what are the texts about then? They're about...
It's ethics, you could say. It's to a great...
But their normativity and their ethics only derives from certain ontological claims. That ethics completely collapses if you take away all of that. So how do they...
Yeah. So, the way how I kind of make sense of these trends, how I try to localize them in the greater, history of thinking, of thought, is that it's a way of doing Jean-Paul Sartre, existentialism as a humanism. This is kind of, I think that it's a little bit more in your terrain, but Paul Tillich and his work, right, I think has been accused also of making the connection between doubt and faith in such a way that it actually becomes so existential that it's no longer needing history, no longer needing salvation history, or it does no longer need a resurrected Christ or a returning Christ. So perhaps we can go back to this after looking a little bit at the deposits of faith and doubt traditions in those texts, because then we might have a little bit more fuel. I'm thinking to evaluate the legitimacy of Tillich's or Brüggemann's or other theologians' claims. So what is for me striking is, when I'm looking at those texts, that you have both in Matthew and Mark these contrasts between apistoio, right? So unbelief and belief. So they are word pairs. So it seems like that they don't cancel each other easily out. So even though then Jesus says, only the believer will be saved, the unbeliever will not be saved, you still have these unbelieving believers. So for me, it's like John obviously is, I think, is playing this game to the extreme in his last chapter, where Jesus reveals himself, shows himself. Actually, it's Jesus who speaks to Mary in John, while it's the angel in the other Gospels. So she sees Jesus. And then you have the Emmaus disciples who see Jesus, but the text says in a passive, they were not made to see him. So it was not in their control somehow. So somehow the resurrected appearance of Jesus is different than the Jesus that they must have seen or remembered before the resurrection. So it's not their fault almost. The text almost excuses their ignorance. And then when they see it, then you have the Thomas episode where Jesus reveals himself again and makes statements about faith and unfaith. And then you have in chapter 21, last chapter, you have this very interesting episode where Jesus appears at the sea, at the Lake of Galilee, and John recognizes him. He says, "This is the Lord." But then nobody really knows what to do with it, because when they get to the beach, then it says nobody dared to ask, "Who are you?" Why? Because they knew who he was. So this is to me so interesting. So they are not sure, because they would like to ask, "Who are you?" But then they feel ashamed to ask it, because in fact they know that it is he who it is. How do you deal with these texts? I'm just very curious, whether this is just my biography that picks up these weird strengths and tries to tackle them, or how did this obvious theme get processed by you?
Yes. Well, I want to run something by you, and I don't know if I am correct with this, and feel free to push back. So I have this almost like a double reading of what is going on there. I mean, on the one level, and both seem to be true at the same time. On the one level, there's no doubt that the New Testament is attacking doubt. Mm-hmm. Doubt is not something to be celebrated. So it's not something to be valorized. Perhaps not quite demonic, but it's something that should be transitioned, because anyone who doubts is unstable. Yes, Thomas doubts, but he's being rebuked on account of that. Yet at the same time, it almost seems, and this might be too much of a reading into the text, and I admit it that that's probably so, that it is almost impossible not to doubt. Given the grandiosity of what Jesus has achieved, the complete, if I can use Nietzsche's language here, transvaluation of everything, of all values, it almost is impossible that the extent to which everything that we as humans could have possibly expected is being turned around. That the only response is a sense of wonder and doubt. Mm-hmm. How is that possible, right? This language of how is that possible. And for me, one of the, perhaps, let me just go a little bit on the side and then come back, of all the narratives that we have around the resurrection of Jesus and these final events, the one that for some reason speaks to me often, things change, it depends, from time to time, but very often the one pericope, or the one story, let me put it that way, that speaks to me the most is the journey to Emmaus. Mm-hmm. And it is and you will correct me if I'm mispronouncing his name, but the famous Belgian theologian Edward Schillebeeckx, in one instance, once has said that it is this text in Luke that is really the text for us today. That is the modern contemporary text, the most relevant text that we can bring to the world. Because it is a world of two disciples, quite possibly husband and wife, who are leaving the place. Everything is destroyed and everything is newly created, without them yet realizing that it is created. And so this kind of double take on the event. So they're leaving behind the place of their dreams, their expectations, what they thought Jesus would be about, what his ministry would be about, and they're turning away, they're moving away from Jerusalem, from the sacred space into somewhere. Mm-hmm. And we know how the story goes. The fact that they the way Jesus is approaching them always deeply touches me. He must be surprised and chuckling and frustrated. I don't know, and just challenges them, and they're not getting it right. And he's probing them, and I know it's a very powerful story. Now, is that a story of doubt? Yeah, I think it is, and it is almost made understandable. Yet it is also exposed as foolishness. On the one hand, how can you be so foolish to doubt given what the Old Testament is saying? But the whole point is that within this framework of everything being new, in other words, they were not able to see that in the Bible, right? That's the whole point, given their framework that they inhabited. So I don't know if this makes sense, but kind of this interplay of doubt being challenged and kind of being understandable, and yet never really celebrated. Never really, oh, this is kind of a level of sophistication, because we need to push very gently against this idea, something we said before on this show on one context and before, that we live in a culture that is absolutely valorizing doubt. That for the last at least couple of centuries, doubt is identified, or intellectual smartness is identified to doubt. And trust is being negated, is being sort of naive, whereas I think that trust is the primordial human attitude to reality, not doubt. And Loistrup has written about this, and other people have written about that. So it seems to me that we need to push back, and this kind of intellectual aura that is sometimes being ascribed to doubt, we need to kind of push back against that. But at the same time, and this is the last thing I want to say, it speaks something of our times, that there are so many books on doubt that have come out. I'm thinking of Gregory Boyd, I'm thinking of Christian Wyman, I think of many of these people who are writing these Christian books. You can see them in bookstores by Christian publishers that are about doubt, one or the other. They're about doubt. And this speaks about our times in which we live, very unsettling times. So I wonder if you agree with me that we should be cautious about this idea of celebrating and valorizing doubt in a way that the Bible would never do. And I know you have a different take on that. I know doubt plays a significant role for you in your commentary on Lamentations, which we will talk about next time, God willing, in our next episode. So this will come back again. So anyway, so these are some of my thoughts. I don't know if they make any sense.
Oh, yeah. I mean, thank you for organizing kind of these these trends a bit more. I would probably add that overcoming these love affairs with doubt, if you want to say it that way, is, I think, the crux. So because in the New Testament, obviously, this is a topic. Doubt is there. We need to deal with it. We cannot ignore it. But the question is, how do you deal with this? And if you were to argue that there's a reason why actually this doubt culture developed, not only, I think, based on the uncertainties that we are all experiencing in the last 15 years or so, but this love affair with doubt, if I think about Paul Tillich, is already starting in the 50s and in the 60s. And it is, and correct me, I'm interested if this is actually correct, what I'm saying, but I think it's probably also a response to kind of this orthodox experience of Christianity and the orthodox culture of nationalism that developed definitely in the 30s and 40s, where Protestantism took kind of, you could say, a demonic orthodox route by supporting regimes and so on. And they celebrated certainty. Certainty against faith, you could say. We have with Bonhoeffer and Barth much more a celebration of faith and a critique of certainty as religion. And I think part of this is probably what I'm not an expert on Paul Tillich, considering that he left Germany in I think 33, just with the rise of the Nazi Party. There is this sentiment also in his work about let's be critical of certainty, because certainty will cause the greatest massacres that humans are able to produce. I think the question is not so much that there's a problem with doubt, but how to deal with it without falling back into propositional truths that make us then potentially ideologues. So that's, I think, where I would be, and that would be my departure point, and that's where my exegetical interest would kick in. So what do Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do, actually, when they deal with this experience of doubt? Am I sketching at something in a fair way, or would you have to fine-tune this a bit more?
Yeah, so I would say that, it all depends. I mean, doubt is such a complicated topic, and we've moved a little bit away from resurrection to doubt, which I think is appropriate because this is also part of the Christmas story. I think it all depends on what level you're looking at doubt. In some ways, doubt is an essential ingredient for thinking. I think the fact that I am really doubtful that I have a final understanding of A, B, C, and it is this doubt that leads me to further inquiry. In some domain of life, it seems to be that doubt is essential to any kind of cognition and any kind of openness. If I had absolute certainty, actually, in the sense there's nothing more to learn, in other words, the absence of doubt that I understand everything perfectly, that would lead to kind of an enclosure, would lead to sort of stagnation. So in that sense, that is very important. Secondly, I think we need to think about the fact is that the doubt comes in different ways, and doubt has different causes. In my own life, doubt, for instance, came about, again, for different reasons. Sometimes it comes as a result of unanswered prayer. You simply cannot understand why this God who promised that if we believe he will do everything is not happening, but it's happening to others. Sometimes doubt comes really from bad foundations. People have completely misread the Bible or the character of God. And then based on that, they're arriving at truly demonic inferences about God's implication with violence and injustice. And of course you doubt such a deity. Sometimes doubt comes from ignorance. Sometimes people arrive at these ideas, questions, and the way they talk about them, they think that they're the first ones who have ever arrived at these questions. And Christians have been struggling with these issues for 2,000 years almost. And in those 2,000 years have tried to give sometimes quite solid responses to that. So sometimes a very naive reading of the Christian faith or insecure foundations can lead to doubt as well. And that is when I would work with students, especially when I worked with the undergraduate population, and people would come to me and talk about their doubt. I wanted to engage in some sort of genealogy of that, like why are they doubting? And they would say it's for reason X, but then we talk after an hour and it's not X. It's completely something unrelated, which they allowed to fester. They've not addressed them. And I can relate to that. Like in my life, and I was a pastor at one point, something happened with prayers that I prayed and they were not answered. At the same time, I saw inconsequential prayers being answered. I don't know if I've shared the story with you. If I did, please, my apologies. But I remember when that was something very, very important to me, did not come through. And as a pastor, I come to a prayer meeting and someone is praising God that God helped them save $500. I want to smack them. I mean, like, what kind of nonsense is that, right? But as a pastor, I was not able to deal with those emotions. I might have talked about this in any case. And then I suppressed them. And when you suppress questions and you don't confront them, they don't go away, they fester. And honestly, one day, I don't know if I told you that, but one day I really awoke and with this clear thought, I'm not a believer anymore. Not as I doubting. And it was kind of just stepping into an abyss that I thought I was incapable of stepping into. And I meant it like not as a really stopped believing, at least for a little while. And I was a pastor. So it was really an existential crisis. So I'd like to know, like, what is this doubt about? Is it sometimes we doubt because sometimes the doubt actually happens as a precursor to growth. Because the old wineskins don't work anymore. You doubt them, but then something happens. So I'd like to, it's not one thing, it's a manifold. It's an overdetermined concept, and we need to understand like why, how, for what reasons, how long, I think that's
Yeah,
important.
absolutely. You know, I had here a couple of weeks ago, I had a student coming to the office with questions of doubt. And one of the first things that we, you know, obviously we try to get a sense of the landscape of the question that he's struggling with. And one of the first routes then is what I would call an archaeology, right? An archaeology of doubt. So
that's the
to
term.
dig,
yes.
and you quickly then also find out there is actually a very hopeful response to what you're describing as somebody struggling with doubt, and that is, it's not your doubt. So it's a doubt that you have inherited. It's also part of us being children of our time. So and then doing this archaeology, it often can create such relief for the one who is struggling with uncertainty to realize, okay, this is I'm part of a community, and there is a lot of emotional and mental investment that has been done for me and part of the community that I am, to actually find ways of organizing myself and locating myself, and potentially, you know, finding my way out of these more dark zones of life into more meaningful ones. So what I'm curious is, I'll share with you how my rereading now during Easter of the Gospel of Matthew in particular took shape as I'm trying to give this a new run, right? How doubt and faith is being integrated or related in these Gospels. And that is when I'm looking at Matthew's description. So you have Mary Magdalene and Mary on the Sunday morning where they encounter this angel. And there's an interesting, in verse 8, there's this interesting combination of emotions. So they had fear once they encounter the message that Jesus is not there anymore, but that he has resurrected. It's fear and it's great joy. So it's fear and joy. This is a very interesting, I think, emotional connection. So it's a celebration of certainty, perhaps, a celebration of the good news. Our Lord has risen, and at the same time, and I'm now reading obviously into the text because the text does not make it explicit, is this really true? Is this good news really true? I wish it's true, and therefore the joy, but can this be true? And then Jesus responds in the next verse. The first thing is, don't fear. So obviously a comment, if you read this as an emotion of doubt, you don't have to doubt. But then he greets them with, I think in the translations it's more like be greeted or something like this, but actually it's chairete, it's actually be joyful. So affirming the joy. So the faith that they're having, the positive input through the resurrection that they just testified, is being confirmed. So, but now you get into them spreading the message with the disciples, and you have this conspiracy that is being developed by the scribes, right? Where the soldiers are also, they have these two parallel movements. Two people are running into Jerusalem. Two people groups are running into Jerusalem. The ones they want to instill faith, and the other ones to instill confusion. Matthew ends with that the conspiracy was very successful, right? It says, until today, people believe that he was actually robbed. So you have this, and then you have these doubts. The next few verses, you have these doubts among the disciples. Should we believe the conspiracy theory, so to say, or should we believe the ladies that have met Jesus? And then, according to Matthew, Jesus does not really do much about counterfighting these doubts. But what he does is the Great Commission. And that's so striking to me. So he does not engage with arguments or apologetics into proving that he actually is there. But he says, you go out there and preach the gospel. So there's no apologetic against the conspiracy. That's so fascinating for me and Matthew. And now comes my, let's say, my Markian perspective on the gospel of Matthew. And I'm wondering, at the end of Matthew, we are again on a mountain when the Great Commission is happening. And at the beginning of Matthew, we are on a big mountain where Jesus is challenged by the devil. And he is offered all power and authority by the devil. And Jesus rejects. I mean, it seems that he rejects the route of power. And only after the resurrection, after the cross, so to say, he says, I have all power. And so for me, this has created a new lens that I see in Mark, where Mark has so many episodes where Jesus is challenged by the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes and the politicians. And when they ask him a question, for example, I mean, the most radical one would be, I think it's Mark 3 or 4, where they're saying he's demon-possessed. How do you challenge that conspiracy? So there's no way. Every argument you have is just another product of the demon that runs your mind. But then the way how he responds to that, it was never satisfactory to me, because it doesn't seem to be a good argument until I realized he's actually speaking about them. They are divided, Satan against Satan. And he is not trying to argue on the same level. And that's kind of what I see in Matthew. So he's trying to encounter the doubt, not in the ways how the human instinct would work. Let's give evidence. Let's bring an avalanche of evidences into the discourse, and it will settle things. So he's, even after the cross, not seeking the route of power. That's kind of how I'm reading it. I'm not saying that we should celebrate doubt, but that we need to encounter doubt, not just by apologetics. This doesn't seem, at least to Matthew, this doesn't seem to be the route, but rather by mission. So giving a purpose and a direction of living, I mean, if now very global, living a meaningful life as the best medicine against doubt and for faith. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, kind of my reading now of Matthew. What do you think to bringing the discussion about doubt and faith onto the platform of power?
Yeah, I think this is a good question I would need to think about a little bit more. Before I come to that, let me just say one more thing about doubt. Mm-hmm. At one point, I'm coming to it. I'm not sidestepping it. But at one point, I had kind of an old wineskin period in my life where the usual books, sermons, and preachers didn't speak to me anymore. And I went to my muse, my good friend Bogdan Skur, who is a professor. He is Old Testament professor, but teaches all kinds of things at Washington Adventist University. And there's a book that I looked up, and I really wanted to buy it. And then I asked him if he could recommend a book to me, not mentioning to him anything. You know, I need something new, I need something to speak to me. And he recommends that book. And for me, that was a moment. And the book was, I mentioned his name already, Christian Wyman, My Bright Abyss, who is a poet who was away from God for a very long time. And then his journey of coming back to God. It's absolutely beautifully written. And he is an adjunct professor right now at Duke. Is he at Yale? He's at Yale. And he just now, a couple of weeks ago, a book came out where there's correspondence between Wolf and Christian Wyman. And one of the major themes is the theme of doubt. And so they've published this correspondence. It's very accessible. Anyone can pick it up and read it because it's very, very, very accessible. And I have not read it though, but I have it. I will read it when I have time. But I remember that book. This is what I mentioned this in My Bright Abyss. He writes about how genuine doubt is very different. There are two types of doubt. There's a suffocating, lifeless, barren doubt that finds itself, that celebrates itself, that is proud of itself, that is actually completely enclosed and nothing's happening. But genuine doubt is horrible. It is restless. It doesn't let you be at peace. It doesn't let you be with old wineskins. It pushes you. It has a centrifugal force. It is seeking, searching, restless, and all of that. And I think, I mean, when you've seen this, right? You've seen people who have doubt, and it's part of intellectual pride, right? They are this kind of deconstructive posture. They are above you simply because they're inverting everything that you're saying, they're diminishing everything you're saying, they're laughing, they are spoofing or kind of making fun of your naivete. But then there's this doubt that is really soul-tearing, it is restless, it is seeking, it's not at peace with itself. And I think that doubt has enormous potential for growth, and it is great. Now, coming to your question.
But may I just interrupt you? So speaking about the, let's say, the creative energy that this type of doubt, the positive creative energy that this type of unrest can have, I think that's a theological resource that can actually shape worldviews and faith. So I'm really interested in how this continues now.
Yeah. So I think that's a very nice thing. And actually, I think it might be actually worthwhile for me if I'm trying to kind of, as we speak, I try to find this quote by Wyman, because it's absolutely beautiful. But I might not be able to do it on such a short notice. But it's really worth reading. I highly recommend it to anyone who is struggling to kind of pick it up. But here it is, I was able to find it. Let me just read this. He writes the following. This is from My Bright Abyss. You know the value of your doubt, but the quality of the disquiet that it produces in you. Is it a furious, centrifugal sort of anxiety that feeds on itself and never seems to move you in any one direction? Is it an ironclad compulsion to refute, to find in even the most transfiguring experiences, your own or others, some rational or psychological explanation? Is it an almost religious commitment to doubt itself, an assuredness that absolute doubt is the highest form of faith? There's something static and self-enthralled about all these attitudes. Honest doubt, what I would call devotional doubt, is marked, it seems to me, by three qualities. Humility, which makes one's attitude impossible to celebrate. Mm-hmm. Insufficiency, which makes it impossible to rest. And mystery, which continues to tuck you upward, or at least outward, even in your lowest moments. Such doubt is painful, more painful, in fact, than any of the other forms, he continues. But its pain is active rather than passive, purifying rather than stultifying. And then the last sentence, far beneath it, no matter how severe its drought, how thoroughly your skepticism seems to have salted the ground of your soul, faith, durable faith, is steadily taking root. I think this is just
wow, that amazing. Feels like a clinical knife, right? To categorizing, cutting, clarifying. Beautiful. I need to get that quote. So, I mean, on that note, perhaps I would add as my Easter experience this time also is that this doubt, that these doubt traditions that are interwoven in this fabric also, I think, state that faith is not coerced by overwhelming evidence. So that's not what Jesus is fully invested in. He does provide signs, he does give evidence, but the ending of the Gospels don't end with just providing evidence. So there's something bigger than that necessary, and that's the Great Commission in most of the Gospels.
Yeah.
That's one thing. The other thing, as I'm thinking about this, particularly from this Markian perspective, and if I bring doubt and faith and certainty into the power game of asserting authority, it is, for me, revealing that when I look at evidence and how evidence is usually constructed, rationality is constructed, it's usually causalistic. So if A, then you are forced to conclude with B. And if B, then you're forced to conclude with C, and so on. So there's no wiggle room. There is no necessity for you to actually be courageous about taking a stand, because everything is already pre-calculated for you. You just need to acknowledge it. So if this is the way how you want to encounter doubt, namely by absolute calculations, so to say, that don't allow for any other result but this or that result, then you might actually have destroyed the very fabric by which Jesus calls the disciple, namely to hinder a personal relationship. So I think, who is this? Plantinga. Plantinga has this belief in versus believe that, I think. So if we only believe that, so that is, if we only believe in propositional truth, if we have our calculations all set, if we are convicted with certainty, then we might actually have undermined the very essence of faith, and that is a relationship to hang in even when the calculations don't work anymore. So,
Yeah.
or if we don't have calculations available.
Yes.
So any belief that, so to say, there's this belief in the words of Plantinga. And I think that's what I'm seeing in Matthew. So Matthew is describing, here I am, you know me. Peter, speaking to Peter. So it's fine for you to have doubt because I know you are believing in me. The believing that will follow.
Yes.
That's somehow for me the way how Jesus' authority works. It's an authority that is beyond the deterministic. It's beyond the calculatable, which does not mean it's irrational. It's not. It's not beyond evidence. It's not this perhaps very existentialistic reading that we might find with Tillich. It is historical. It is a real relationship in space and time. So that's kind of how, for me, it's a statement about what is divine authority.
Yes, yes. And I fully agree. And perhaps we can end on this note with the realization that there is so much more to say, as always. And I would say my personal take, which resonates with yours, but I don't know if you would consider it to be different than yours, and that's perfectly fine, is that on my end, I understand the role of doubt. There cannot be but doubt in this world. The world is so brutal. Too many prayers are going unanswered. Too much unbelievable suffering is going on for us never to ask questions. Why, God? How is that even possible? Why are you silent? It is, and God knows that we are but dust, and being part of dust is simply not being able to understand. I also understand that doubt is essential for transitional moments. Doubt is important to undermine certainly this certainty that can end up being demonic. And I think that Reinhold Niebuhr, in his Nature and Destiny of Man, like no one else in the history of Christian thought, with the exception of Augustine, wrote so profoundly about pride, and especially intellectual and religious pride, that is absolutely demonic in its character. And I think insofar as doubt expresses more a hesitation, understanding of one's limits, the provisional nature of one's convictions, not because the problem is in God, but the problem is in me, and because coming now to my interest, because the human heart is deceptive above everything. Yes, absolutely, doubt is necessary. But I would say that in an ideal setting, perfect saint would not doubt. It seems to me that I refuse to accord doubt some special spiritual significance or some measure of maturity. We doubt because we are flesh, and we doubt because very often we are immature. But I would never ever say that a saint, and I'm thinking of my mom who never doubted. She never doubts in her faith, ever. There's no doubt in her life. And for me to have the gumption and say, that me kind of whatever with my PhD and now I'm somehow more sophisticated and higher than she is would be absolutely garbage, would be nonsense. I don't believe in that at all. So I have to find a way to look at these saints in our church. So confidence in God is of such a nature that doubt actually never ever enters into their experience, without me invalidating that in any way. So that is kind of my thought that I wanted to.
Yeah, beautiful. To play in harmony with you, perhaps, as we end this episode. Well, First Corinthians 15 actually speaks to the saints. And Paul acknowledges that among the saints, there are also some who doubt. And that's why it's necessary to embrace faith-building sermons and exercises. So if you are somebody who is struggling with the different versions of doubt that we have explored here, it might be a good exercise to enter into a process of sanctification about how you want to cater doubt, or how you want to give doubt a shape in your life. But if it even becomes something on the positive end, something humble, the New Testament acknowledges that these are realities in the community of faith. But speaking, about your mom, it reminds me, and I might have mentioned that here as well in one of our episodes about my grandmother, a deeply critical person, very informed and so on. And when I once tried a Sabbath opening ceremony, I tried to convince her that that you can argue for an agnostic or atheistic position. Some of my colleagues at the university back then were agnostic or atheistic. even though they were studying theology, or while they were studying theology. And I just wanted to challenge my 90-year-old grandma to admit that this is at least a rational possibility. And she looked just pretty lame at me and said, no, it's not possible that God does not exist. And so, okay, grandmom, why? Give me the argument, why? And she said, because Jesus changed me. That was it.
That's it.
So let's believe in.
Yeah. What a beautiful way to end. Oliver, thank you so much for the conversation. I think our next episode focusing on your work on Jeremiah and specific Lamentations is going to be a rejoinder, a follow-up, I'm sure, on some of these themes, especially what is one doing in the context of catastrophe, when everything that you know has fallen apart, or the frames of reference that you have grown up with, when the culture disappears. What happens to identity? What happens to you as a people, as an individual? And I'm sure we are going to have a fantastic time in talking about this project. But until
Excellent.
then, I wish you all the best. Blessings to you, and stay strong and healthy. Goodbye.
See you next time. Thanks for the conversation.